Woman is shut up in a kitchen or in a boudoir, and astonishment is expressed that her horizon is limited. Her wings are clipped, and it is found deplorable that she cannot fly. Simone de Beauvoir, a forerunner in the French feminist movement, once depicted the dire situation facing women in her famous work, The Second Sex. 400 years before Beauvoir, far back in the dying days of the Ming Dynasty, in the 16th century, there was someone who shared her thinking. A man, perhaps surprisingly.
人有男女之别，但如果说见识也分男女，怎么可能？见识有高低之分。说男子的见识全都高远，女人的见识全是短浅，岂不可笑
？In 1593, an incident happened in Macheng, Hubei. A teacher named Li Zhe decided to teach openly at a Buddhist temple, and his audience included a widow named Ming Dynasty. 400 years ago, such an incident caused a great sensation in society of seismic proportions. Li Zhe was quite famous for his unbridled spirit. When he was only 12, he started writing articles ridiculing Confucius, and in the following decades, he criticized many well-respected Confucian masters, including Mencius, Zhu Xi, and Zhou Duanyi. While targeting ethics preached by the Confucian school, he advocated equality and exhorted people to retain a childlike innocence. Li Zhe resigned from office when he was 54 and then went to Macheng. He opened a school at a Buddhist temple where he openly had his long hair cut and taught both female and male students. Among his students was a lady named Ming Dynasty. Though she was from a respected family, the mere fact that he had allowed a woman to enter the school was scandalous, angering many moralists. They mainly lashed out at Li Zhe. Some so-called well-meaning men suggested to him that he should no longer teach female students, since they had no vision. In response to this, Li Zhe wrote this letter to those kind-hearted friends.
倘若一个女人乐于听到政论，乐于学习超脱世俗的佛道，明白俗世不值得留恋，恐怕当今世上的男子见着她都该羞愧流汗。这样的人，不正是孔圣人也希望遇到的人才吗？可是现在，这样的人却被看作是见识短浅的人，太冤枉了吧？但是冤枉不冤枉，对于他本人没什么关系。害臊的、出丑的，只是这些有偏见的旁观者罢了。
In ancient China, females generally lived difficult lives, especially in the Ming and Qing dynasties. If you were a female born into a gentry's family in the Ming Dynasty, you would not be allowed to dine with men after the age of 7. Precepts for Women, Regulations for Women, and Biography of Exemplary Women would be your compulsory courses. In the era of Mei Danran, a Spaniard traveled to China and described what he saw in China in his journal. In Guangzhou, apart from frivolous prostitutes and working women of the lowest classes, I saw no women at all. In Jiading, there was a woman whose surname was Xuan, who was subjected to domestic violence by her husband. But after the death of her husband, she had to, along with another widow, hang herself. This was what society required of a virtuous woman back in those days. Xuan was just one of the many virtuous women chronicled in the history of the Ming Dynasty. According to historical accounts, virtuous women in the Ming Dynasty who had similar experience to Xuan numbered no less than 36,000. Mei Danran, despite her identity as a widow, disdained to follow suit. Her father, Mei Guoqian, was not only once the Vice Minister of War, which was a very high-ranking position, but also quite a famous scholar. Li Jie and Mei Danran came to the fore due to the prominence of the Mei family.
周武王之妻易姜，与周公、少公、太公等人并列武王时期的10个治国贤臣。武王之母太姒与名臣散宜生太颠等并称四友。可这些女子要是让市井小儿听说了，一定要求他们遵循3从4德，做个不出闺房、相夫教子的妇人。如此对待太姒、易姜这样的女子，岂不荒谬？
Instead of preaching women's virtues, Li Jie had profound appreciation of women's wisdom and ability. So he was fighting for equality between men and women. He praised Mei Danran and called her teacher, and held the belief that despite her gender, few men could compare with her. Mei Danran had a rather unfortunate life. After her engagement, her husband died before she moved into his family. To avoid an arranged marriage, she decided to learn Buddhism without cutting her hair, which meant celibacy in that era. In the teeth of criticism, she took Li Jie as her mentor and began academic dialogue with him. "
见识短的人，只能看到100年以内的事，或者更近，只看到自己。有远见的人，则可以超脱形骸之外，看透生死之间，达到历经劫难也淡然自若的境界。"
In 1601, arson destroyed the Buddhist temple where Li Jie taught. 1 year later, Zhang Wenda, an official from the Ministry of Rites, submitted a memorial to Emperor Shenzong to censure Li Jie. Li Jie was accused of spreading heresy to deceive the general public. Zhang Wenda accused Li Jie of 4 major wrongdoings, and one of them was that he tempted some females to his temple. This was a reference to the Mei Danran case. Li Jie, then 76 years old, was found guilty. As for Mei Danran, an extraordinary woman who resisted the trend of her times, she's briefly referred to in the history books, which say she was slandered to death and died at the age of 37. Li Jie wrote to a friend who was trying to save him from death. Neither dying in prison nor on the battlefield would be undesired, so there was no need to bother rescuing him. One morning in early spring, Li Jie committed suicide with a razor. So it was that the ever-stubborn Li Jue stalwartly faced his martyrdom and achieved it. The late Ming Dynasty gave birth to Li Jue, but the fact is, it didn't deserve to have him. Li Jue's thinking lit up that era, but in a sense, it showed that the once prosperous Ming Dynasty was nearing its end. Are the so-called tough women something new? Something that existed only in this era? The answer is no. Gu Ruopu, a single mother living in Hangzhou in the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, is a woman who could compare with any tough woman living in modern times.
丈夫的离开让我悲伤到了极点，躲在宾所的帷帐后流泪，忘了他已经逝去多时。我为什么还能活着，在这里继续写诗作赋呢？
This letter was written by Gu Ruopu, a female poet of the late Ming Dynasty, to her younger brother, Gu Ruojun. In 1619, when Gu Ruopu was 28, her husband died, leaving her alone with 2 children to support. In spring the following year, Huang succumbed to illness. The prospects of his elderly father, young children, and family were gloomy indeed. What would the newly widowed Gu Ruopu do?
为贞洁而死简单，守贞洁却不易。孩子们还小，我要像唐代柳仲颖的母亲那样，用熊胆煎制药丸，帮助孩子强身健体。学欧阳修的母亲，用树枝在地上写字，教孩子读书，一点点的等待他们长大。
Women living in the Ming and Qing dynasties didn't have control over their own lives. Women with similar experiences to Gu Ruopu would generally remarry someone else so as to ease the pressures they faced. If they could count on their next husband, they would find life easier and more stable. But Gu Ruopu chose a different path. She decided to be alone. Thoroughly garnering the entire wealth of her family, she carefully arranged how money should be spent. At the same time, she supplemented the family income by weaving. She had 2 children, one 8 and the other 6. Apart from keeping house, she also undertook to educate the children.
我一直惴惴不安，担心辜负东升最初的志向。 将来九泉之下，也没有颜面见他。做饭织布之余，我就翻开家中收藏的书籍， 从四书五经到古史鉴、皇明通记和大政记，日夜阅读，只觉得时间不够。孩子们进来，我就让他们点亮灯笼，坐在屋中一角，讲解我读书的领悟。有时候我还带着他们背书，到3更半夜才罢。我以此为乐，并不觉得疲倦。
If we look at her from today's perspective, then it's safe to say that Gu Ruopu could be called an educator. To make sure her children would be successful in the future, she not only tried to learn together with them, but also managed to explore new ways of educating them. In this connection, she once built a boat and put it by the side of the broken ridge of the West Lake, thus creating an environment in which her children could dedicate themselves to study. So it was that her 2 children, Huang Tan and Huang Wei, slowly grew up to become famous Hangzhou scholars. What makes her so special is that she emphasized the importance of educating females, and with that in mind, she enlightened all the females in the Huang and Gu families, encouraging them to read, study, pay attention to current affairs, and express their thoughts with poems. She also cultivated the very first female literary group in Chinese history, the Jiao Yuan Poetry Society. Some scholars go even further, inferring that when Tao Shijin was creating female characters for Dream of the Red Chamber, he drew on the example of the Jiao Yuan Poetry Society. They also hold that grandmother Jia in the novel was based on Gu Ruopu. But that's not to say that Gu's efforts were appreciated by the older generation. As a matter of fact, many, especially older females, criticized Gu for what she did. Gu retorted that equal emphasis should be laid on both men's and women's education. Only when women were possessed of knowledge could they become good wives and mothers.
时日一长，见识也一天天累积，这些圣贤之书可以洗涤心性。我还要读《诗经》《离骚》这样的诗赋，那些悠游潇洒的词句，仿佛可以寄托心中的哀思，舒缓满怀的愤懑，不至于因为忧愁而生病。春天鸟儿鸣唱，夏天虫儿唧唧，它们感应时节发出声响。我呢，也随性写下文章，藏在箱子里。虽然也是不平则鸣，但哪敢与古时候的班昭佐分相比，就是邯郸学步罢了。
More and more females of her era gradually became enlightened, and affected by her deeds, they started to choose to live in their own way. A new trend had started in Hangzhou. Huang Yuanjia was one of these women. She was born into a literary family and had quite a talent for painting. She lived with her husband by the West Lake. But while her husband dealt with family affairs, she became the breadwinner for the family by selling her paintings. These females, thanks to their hard work, managed to break through the strict social conventions of the time, earning more respect and recognition for women. Records indicate that Gu Ruopu enjoyed great longevity. Even at the age of 90, she was still devoting herself to a life of study. What's all the more remarkable is that while supporting a whole family, she also managed to live a legendary life. If today's college entrance examination is like walking a single log bridge, then in ancient times, the imperial examination was like a high-altitude tightrope walk. Little wonder that most people who made it across are remembered in history. To pass the examination, all the candidates had to endure the same suffocating atmosphere. During the reign of Emperor Qianlong in the Ming Dynasty, a scholar called Yuan Tong got into a dispute related to the imperial examination.
阿通啊，已经17岁了，在家吃得好，穿得好，读书却很懒惰。送他到江宁县报考，主要是想磨砺他，并非真指望他能考上。如果能通过考试加入江宁县籍，就再好不过了。毕竟江宁是祖宗丘墓之地，一旦舍弃，我心中怎么过意得去呀？谁知道这件事让江宁本地人不满，以冒充籍贯的罪名把阿通告到官府。但这事儿啊，我并不怨恨他们，反而认为是坏事变好事。为什么呢？因为我的确有私心。
Yuan Mei, a famous Qing Dynasty literateur, was childless despite being already 60 years old. So his cousin, Yuan Shu, decided that his son, Yuan Tong, would be adopted by Yuan Mei. Yuan Mei lived in Hangzhou, but his ancestral tombs were located in Jianning, today's Nanjing. The Yuan family considered Jianning their homeland, and if Yuan Tong could study in Jianning, they would feel that one of their wishes had been met. Besides, Yuan Mei knew that in Jianning, the learning environment was less intense, with less fierce competition. In 1791, in attending the imperial examination held in Jianning, Yuan Tong was accused of illegally using a false household registration certificate. As a result, he was disqualified from attendance at the examination. Yuan Shu felt indignant, so he went to the local government office to vent his grievances. Yuan Mei, however, took a vastly different stance and wrote this letter to his cousin.
参加考试其实是次要的，有没有真才实学是根本。阿通如果有才华，考到江宁还是杭州都可以，甚至不参加考试都行。可如果没有真才实学，考到哪里也不行。咱们身为长辈的，不去教导后辈读书学问的道理，而同别人争嫌弃，有必要吗？还是好好根据阿通的本性，因材施教吧。
Jiangsu and Zhejiang had been important provinces as far as the imperial examination was concerned since ancient times. There were so many students attending the exam that it would be impossible to overstate how intense the competition was. If Yuan Tong was not given a free pass, there would definitely be more cases of this kind. The objection of students in Jianning was quite legitimate. Yuan Shu, eager to see his son become successful, had taken leave of his senses. Yuan Mei, on the other hand, appraised things more soberly. Yuan Tong was clever, but had no especial liking for study. One year, during the Double Ninth Festival, Yuan Mei came up with one line of a couplet and asked Yuan Tong to finish the second one. The first line was, "There is a place for the family to climb to commemorate the event." And the second line, given by Yuan Tong, was, "The class will never come to an end." His personal experience is also how students have felt for hundreds of years. The longing for the end of the class remains unchanged.
知子莫若父，阿通文理粗浮，离秀才二字还相距很远。我想起了李鹤峰的女儿李含章，他的儿子考试失利，他曾安慰道：“我当年生你，绝不是为了求功名才叫你去读书的。”现在的士大夫们都没有他这样的气魄和见解，应该羞愧得无地自容。要是不明白这个道理，即使有了功名，也一定会误国殃民，害人害己。没有基础的墙，虽高必倒。咱们如今这么做，不是爱孩子，而是在害他。
When Yuan Mei was writing this letter, he was already 75. Looking back, he had some deep feelings about the cruelty of the imperial examination and the hardship during his career as a government official. He was quite talented, even when he was just a kid. He passed the imperial examination at the county level along with his teacher when he was just 12. When he was 23, he performed well in the provincial exam. The second year, he passed the metropolitan exam. Then, he came 5th in the palace exam, finally being appointed a candidate for future official appointment. But 3 years later, Yuan Mei got the lowest grade in a Manchu examination. As a result, he was sent to the south of the Yangtze River area to serve as a county magistrate. Aspiring to be an official in favor with the locals, he worked hard to fight droughts and locust plagues, and he achieved some positive results in governing the county. Having worked as an official for years, he gradually came to the realization that many entered this field to serve their own interests rather than those of the people. As a man of lofty ideals, Yuan Mei didn't want to bow to others for promotion. After 10 more years in politics, aged just 33, he decided to resign and return to where he was.
人所处的境况啊，各不相同。有的人不得不求科名，比如我和你，家里没有土地，不去读书求取科名，这一辈子的生活都没有着落。有的人呢，则不一定非要求科名，好比阿通，如果能在家安分守己，不造事端，没有丑行，像汉代马援的弟弟马绍游所讲的那样，做个乡亲邻里口中的好人，就是咱们家的好孩子了。我死后啊，也能瞑目，还奢求什么呢？
Yuan Mei started a new life when he was 33, and thus felt more detached from an earthly life. He bought a deserted manor in Jianning and made it into a specially designed private garden, which was called Sui Garden, or Garden of Contentment. What made it special was that the garden had no external walls, which is kind of like today's public garden. Yuan Mei turned it into a place for study, meeting and teaching. As a gastronome, he even made recipes from the Garden of Contentment, which represents one of the famous ancient books for cooking and enjoying Chinese cuisine. He described 326 delicacies, which could stimulate people's appetite. The Sui Garden, as a result, soon became a tourist destination in Suzhou and Hangzhou.
我们的子孙也是这天地间的一苍生，他们是他们，我们是我们。世人太过于庇护和宠爱他们了。
Yuan Tong was so lucky that he had such an open-minded mentor. Yuan Mei passed away when Yuan Tong was 23, and Yuan Tong followed his own heart, managed to find his vocation as a poet, and eventually established a name for himself in literary circles. A smooth and happy life was what Yuan Mei wished for Yuan Tong. Even today, during a time when many parents live in great anxiety due to their children's grades in school, the poet Yuan Mei, more than 200 years ago, still offers us a great example of how to deal with issues regarding children's education. Our life is not just an exam, and there is no standard answer to the questions that arise in the course of it. That should be the case with regard to parenting as well. These bamboos represent a man with a free and unrestrained spirit, and a vigorous and sharp mind. They show that the painter was making a representation not just of bamboo, but also of himself. Every stroke demonstrates his pride and stubbornness.
"天地间第一等人，只有农夫。读书人是士农工商的最后一等。最好的农夫可以耕种100亩地，差一点的70、80亩没问题，再次也有50、60亩。他们损耗身体，付出辛劳，养活天下人。假使没有农夫，全天下的人都要饿死喽。"
The writer of this letter was Zheng Banqiao, an unusual personality in Ming Dynasty painting and calligraphy circles, the leading light of the so-called 8 eccentrics of Yangzhou. The letter was written to Zheng Mo, Zheng Banqiao's cousin, and was sent in the year 1744. Back then, the 51-year-old Zheng Banqiao served as magistrate of Fanxian County in today's Henan province. The trajectory of his career was a rough one, as it passed through the reigns of Emperors Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong respectively. When he was already 43, he finally passed the palace examination. But as he lacked sophistication, he had difficulties dealing with complex interpersonal relations in officialdom, and endured 6 years without an official appointment. But when he was about 50, he finally got appointed magistrate, thanks to the recommendation of others. While he took up the appointment, his wife and children stayed behind in their hometown, Taizhou, in the care of his cousin Zheng Mo, as Zheng Banqiao had no brothers of his own. After receiving a letter from Zheng Mo saying that he had harvested over 15,000 kilograms of crops in autumn, Zheng Banqiao was quite happy. This showed that while Zheng Banqiao's cousin had no flair for official or literary manners, he was more than able to handle domestic business. A true peasant who could ably farm 20 hectares of land for the Zheng family.
我曾经嘲笑唐人写的七夕诗，他们谈论牛郎织女，总是绕不开哀怨的主题，实在是脱离了这个传说原本的意味。织女代表一之源，牛郎代表十之本，他们作为天星，身份最为尊贵，老天都眷顾他们，普通人却不明白衣食的重要。咱们家乡的妇人，虽然不能织绸织布，但能主持家务、干针线活，也算是不失勤劳的本色。
Zheng Banqiao was a peasant's child, and he grew up in the countryside. By the time he was born, his family's fortunes had already declined, so he lived in straitened circumstances. His mother passed away when he was very young, so he was raised by his wet nurse, an honest working woman who exerted great influence on Zheng Banqiao. little surprised that Zheng had a natural affinity with peasants. When he served as magistrate of Fanxian County, he used to make field visits to see by himself how the local peasants were living. Sometimes he would wear casual clothes and do farm work with them. After work, he would eat with them without the airs of an official. He hated those who were born into peasant families but forgot who they truly were once they stepped into officialdom, writing articles in mockery of them, and saying that many people who became rich and powerful easily forgot the simple pleasures of their hometowns. Such comments earned censure and criticism from his colleagues. As far as they were concerned, Zheng was just a strange person.
现在的读书人可不一样喽，一捧书本，就想着考举人、中进士、做大官。做官之后，又盘算着如何赚大钱、造房子、买田产。他们呀，从一开始便走错了路，后来越走越偏，总没个好结果。 还有一些没发迹的人，就在乡里为非作歹，言行丑陋，真让人受不了。这世上难道就没有人看重自己的品德吗？难道就没有人拥有经世济民的理想吗？难道就没有人希望自己的心性高洁，堪比古人吗？其实。 有很多的，但是好人总被坏人牵累，实在是有口难辩呐。
While serving as magistrate of Weixian County in Shandong, Zheng Banqiao experienced a famine year. Defying others' objection, he opened the official granary to save more than 10,000 people, offering grain in return for IOUs. That said, in autumn, the crops failed, so he burned all the IOUs. Local people were grateful for what Zheng did for them, so they built memorial temples in his honor. When Zheng was 60, Weixian County endured another serious famine, so he submitted a petition to his superior asking for permission to open the granary, but his petition was delayed. Faced with a growing emergency situation, he opened the granary in advance of official permission. It was a decision that forced his resignation, bringing his short career in officialdom to an end.
我一生中最敬重的是农夫，新来的佃户，咱们一定要以礼相待。他们称我们为主人，我们称他们为客户。 主客本来就应该平等，我们有什么好尊贵的？而他们又有什么低贱的呢？我们要体恤他们，怜悯他们。如果他们需要借贷，就要成全；那无力偿还的，就宽让他们。
In 1753, Zheng Banqiao resigned and returned to his hometown with 3 donkeys carrying all his belongings. In the spring of 1765, he drew the famous painting Bamboos and Rocks. One day out in the wilderness, on the edge of a cliff, he saw some windswept bamboos. Yet, weak as they seemed, they still had their resilience and pride. The scene which inspired this famous painting inspired an equally famous poem. Between broken rocks, striking my root deep, I bite the mountain green and won't let go. From whichever direction the winds leap, I remain strong, though dealt many a blow. What ultimately is the secret of a happy life? Over the course of 5,000 years of Chinese history, only a few have been able to discover it. And Fan Li of the spring and autumn period was one of them.
我们知道，春天生发，冬天消乏，人有盛衰，福祸相依。懂得进退，知晓福祸，洞悉生死，这才称得上是贤人。
In 473 BC, while a great feast was in progress, unknown forces were gathering. The protagonist of the feast was Go Jian, king of the state of Yue. That year, the army of Yue had conquered the state of Wu, making Go Jian the new hegemon. Fan Li and Wen Zhong, key aides to Go Jian, were important guests at the feast. Both had done a lot to help Go Jian become the hegemon. Go Jian had once been held hostage in the state of Wu for 3 years. During that time, Fan Li had been his constant companion, sharing all kinds of suffering with him. Meanwhile, Wen Zhong stayed in the state of Yue, encouraging females to breed silkworms so as to gain more wealth, and training soldiers for when the time came to fight back. The two of them, one within the state of Wu itself and one outside, worked together to make Go Jian win. But though the days of hardship were destined to come to an end, the good times were slow in coming. It's recorded that on the night of the feast, Fan Li left the state with a small boat without informing anyone. In accordance with unofficial history of Wu and Yue, Fan Li left with his beloved Xi Shi. Before leaving, he left this letter to his friend Wen Zhong.
我虽不才，但我知道进退。我知道鸟打尽了，良弓就没有用处了。兔子死绝了，猎狗就会被人烹食。越王其人，像貌似长脖子尖嘴的鸟，有鹰的眼睛，还有狼的步伐。
When all the birds are killed, bows will no longer be needed. And when all the rabbits are killed, hunting dogs will be cooked. That is a motto Fan Li left for future generations. Shakespeare wrote something similar in Henry IV. Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. The dilemma facing a king is precisely this, the weakness of men. Fan Li had been through fire and water with Go Jian and knew the nature of the king's personality. The spring and autumn period's struggle for hegemony was about to end in a fight between Yue and Wu, and the tension was only rising. Fu Chai, the king of Wu, and Go Jian, the king of Yue, were sworn enemies. Go Jian had killed Fu Chai's father, so Fu Chai was determined to wreak his revenge. The threat from the neighboring state made Go Jian nervous. His only choice was to stage a pre-emotive strike and wage war against Wu. Fu Chai fought back with the best soldiers and fell on the Yue army on all fronts, encircling them on the Kuaiji mountain. Before meeting their end, Fan Li advised Wen Zhong to go to the state of Wu for peace negotiations. Thanks to Wen Zhong bribing senior officials in Wu, Fu Chai spared Go Jian. Instead, Go Jian was held hostage in Wu for 10 years, submissively and humbly working as a stable hand. In fact, Go Jian was such a placid prisoner that Fu Chai lost his sense of vigilance.
这样的人，可与之共患难，但绝不可与他同安乐。危险的境地， 他才需要你。安全的时候，你对他来说一无是处。现在你若还不离开，日后他必将加害于你。
Wen Zhong knew less about human nature than Fan Li. Even after receiving Fan Li's letter, he still chose to stay on as aide to Gu Jian. But later, Gu Jian was tipped off that Wen Zhong was about to rebel. So, by Gu Jian's order, a sword was granted to him, and he was forced to commit suicide. After leaving the state of Yue, Fan Li started a new life, coming to the state of Qi, where he lived under a strange new name, Che Yi Zi Pi, literally meaning a wine vessel made of cowhide. Fan Li was really good at doing business. While tilling land, he also worked in the seafood trade. Soon he rose to fame as a wealthy merchant. The state of Qi paid great attention to commerce, and merchants were respected. So Fan Li was invited by the king of Qi to become one of his ministers of state. According to the records of the grand historian, Fan Li donated his wealth to those in need on multiple times, becoming one of the earliest philanthropists ever to be recorded in history. In his later years, he lived in Taoqiu, Shandong, becoming the famous Lord Taozhu. It's recorded in history that both Fan Li and Wen Zhong were born in the state of Chu, and that Fan Li behaved so strangely that he was regarded as a maniac, so much so that only Wen Zhong was willing to approach him. The two of them later went on to the state of Yue to assist Gu Jian. Ultimately, though, they were good friends. The two of them, when faced with a turning point in life, chose different paths in life. One chose to leave, while the other chose to stay. Ever since ancient times, the reality for most people has been to live according to normal conventions, the patterns of their lives determined by prearranged tracks. But there have always been a few people who are determined to break the mold and live differently. These people have enlightened whole eras and epochs with their wisdom and courage.